Hello, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation and also an Eye on China columnist for ThePrint. So, this week I focused on what is the Chinese discourse on the tripartite meeting that held in Beijing between China, Iran, and Russia. So, the meeting was held last week. The agenda was to discuss the stalemate, the complexities around the Iran nuclear issue, and how to tackle the Western sanctions that Iran is under right now. So, the current geopolitics is fast changing. But then, if we look at the Middle East, that's the region that is ever evolving and that is changing and that is changing fast. And if there is one country that seems ready to take full advantage of this shifting dynamic, I think that's China. I don't think that any other country, any other regional power that has aspirations to play a greater role is actually focusing on what's happening in the Middle East. Of course, what's happening in the Middle East right now is the um, conflict in Palestine, and I think this is one of the major focus when it comes to the Middle East. But then China is taking advantage of what else is happening in the region. So the recent high-level meeting in Beijing brought together deputy foreign ministers from the three countries, and in the Chinese discourse, it was framed as a diplomatic effort to address Iran's nuclear issue. And of course, this has been the official discourse as well. That China is a responsible stakeholder. This is when all the conflicts, all the differences need to be resolved at the diplomatic level. So, of course, the discourse within the strategic community and the government isn't really very different. But I think when we discuss this, we have to be real about it. This is hardly about the news. I think it is more about power, influence, and taking advantage of a reshuffling Middle Eastern geopolitics. So, what's going on and why does it matter? Let's break it down. So, in my view, but I think it's also important to have a little backstory. So, it originally pitched the idea of forming this three country alliance with China and Russia a little while ago. And the reason, of course, is very clear. Iran has been trying to counter Western sanctions, and it wants to break out of its economic isolation. And for Iran, from Iran's perspective, who are the countries that are better than China and Russia to do that? Of course, Russia is also in the same bracket. Western sanctions, the West is trying to isolate Russia. So, and China is seen as a reliable partner by Russia, by Iran. So I think that's, if you look at from the perspective of Iran and Russia, China is absolutely one of the major reliable partners when it comes to ending the Western sanction, or at least try to project that these countries are not alone. But here's the interesting part. When Iran initially pitched this idea, China wasn't immediately on board. There were a lot of apprehensions both at the strategic level and at the official level. And back then, Beijing foreign policy at least was a projection of non-alignment and non-confrontation. Of course, this is just an official discourse. The reality on ground and how what China does is totally different. And at that point of time, getting too close to Iran and Russia at the same time wasn't exactly projected as a win-win situation for China. And let's be honest, neither of those countries comes without baggage. And this is a baggage that perhaps China wasn't really ready to take it on its shoulder, not at that point of time. And Chinese commentators and strategic community at the time were urging caution. The message from them was clear that Beijing didn't want to be dragged into this unnecessary geopolitical entanglements. And being friends with Iran and Russia, sure, that's absolutely an idea, specifically from Chinese strategic psyche, but locking itself into an anti-Western alliance, not so much. As in, of course, China has been talking about providing or establishing a platform that is an alternative to the Western liberal order. But then being too close to Russia and Iran, both at the same time, is absolutely projected as something that is completely anti West. And I think at that point of time, China perhaps wasn't ready, specifically when we have been seeing for the past years that how the tech and trade rivalry between US and China have been a nuisance for China. So I do believe that played an important role why China wasn't really very upfront about forming this alliance. But then now, if we fast forward to today, the winds have absolutely shifted. Trump's foreign policy, which appended a lot of international norms, his transactional approach, his America first, that is being seen as an isolationist approach. Of course, there are debates, there are interpretations of it, but this is how a lot of countries, including China, is seeing it. So, all these developments actually pushed China to rethink its diplomatic playbook. And in the past weeks, in fact, I have written a number of Eye on China columns on how Chinese diplomacy is being shaped in this chaotic Trump's world. And do check those out on Print's website to see how this is being changed and how Trump is impacting Chinese foreign policy. So now with Washington pulling out of agreement from everywhere, and remember the Iran nuclear deal withdrawal. So Beijing now started seeing this as an opportunity. Why don't we, for example, why don't they take a position? Why don't they fill the vacuum where the US is not present? So, and I think one of the outcomes of this is, of course, there has been a crisis, as in all these issues need to have a collective international solution to it. But I think with the crisis, there's also an opportunity for China, and I do believe that China is being um, projecting itself as a reliable partner or seeing this as an opportunity rather than a crisis. So China is now stepping as a reliable partner. At least that's how it is framing itself to be. And this Beijing meeting, it was all about reinforcing that narrative. And if you look at the Chinese foreign policy, Chinese diplomacy, I think it's all about forming and establishing a narrative. And I think this is why the column that I do for Print is something that's so important to understand what is Chinese foreign policy and how it is reshaping its role and regional diplomacy as well as global diplomacy. And I think the key is to look at Chinese discourse. So, in fact, if we focus on this particular issue on the Chinese social media, particularly on Weibo, the reaction was telling. And in fact, one Weibo user summed it up. He said that negotiations on the Iranian nuclear issue have begun again, but this time there is no US. And China is going to lead the issue as well as lead the world. So this confidence in China is so much, is very much there if we look at the discourse among different stakeholders, among different groups. But I do see it as a little dramatic, and perhaps it is a little dramatic, but it does give us an insight into how China wants this story to be told and what role it wants to envisage for itself, at least in this issue. So, but I think it's also important to emphasize or perhaps re-emphasize that the meeting wasn't just about the Iranian nuclear program. It wasn't just about establishing peace and normalize the Middle Eastern region where the conflict has been very rampant on multiple fronts. In fact, I think it was more about China's broader Middle Eastern strategy. And in the past years, what we have seen that Beijing has been busy with brokering the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, facilitating Palestinian reconciliation talks, and now wanting to take a lead role on Iranian's nuclear issue. And I think here where it gets interesting. China's game plan in the Middle East is very different from the US approach. And instead of military intervention or direct confrontation with countries, China is all about soft power, mediation, economic ties, and making these countries feel relevant, making these countries feel that China is a partner that these countries could rely on. And but let's not be naive about it. While China plays the role of the peace broker, it is also securing its own strategic interest, whether that's energy, security, economic influence, or and more importantly, reducing Western dominance in the region. Be it Central Asia, be it Middle East, I think this has been the objective for China since at least 1990s. And in fact, a Baidu commentator described this meeting as a great power game to rearrange the Middle Eastern chessboard. And I don't think that they are wrong about it, as I think about it. With China and Russia openly backing Iran now, I'm pretty sure that that might also happen if situation changes. Specifically, now what we have to see what Trump does in the Middle East. The balance of power would also shift. And second point about this is that Iran, that is already wary of negotiating under US pressure, now trust Beijing and Moscow more. And meanwhile, the US, after years of dominating Middle Eastern diplomacy, shaping the diplomacy there in the region, is suddenly on the sidelines. Of course, there's a lot on the US plate, but China is absolutely filling the vacuum. But from Iran's perspective, this is a big win. It signals that it has powerful allies that are willing to challenge the US influence. And for China, it's absolutely a step forward, cementing itself as a major diplomatic force in the region. And it's just not the social media users or analysts that are saying this. Prominent Chinese scholars have been quite vocal about this as well. For example, Shan Tangli, who's a prominent professor at Shanghai's Fudan University, he made a direct contrast between Chinese and the US approach in the Middle East. He argued that while Washington breaks agreements, Beijing upholds them. And that, according to him, is why countries in the Middle East are leaning towards China more. Then another analyst, Xiaolin, he pointed out that China was instrumental in the original 2015 Iran nuclear deal. So its involvement now isn't exactly out of the blue, but it's instrumental even today. The question now is how far China will go. And here's the bigger picture, that for years and years, the US and its allies have largely dictated the global rules. Um, Global rules of engagement, global rules of diplomacy. Now, China is trying to position itself as an alternative, a country that doesn't just follow the rules, but helps set them. And in the Middle East, where the US credibility has taken a hit, China's role as a trusted partner, a trusted mediator, is absolutely gaining traction. And of course, there is precedence. China has proven that it has the capability, it has the influence, and it has that bonhomie to influence the politics in the Middle East. And Iran, which has long distrusted Western powers and been categorized as a rogue state, is more than happy to engage with Beijing on its own terms. And but now, and it's a big but, mediation is one thing, actually solving conflict is another. We have seen that China has been able to successfully broker agreements, but then the conflicts and the bigger issues haven't really been resolved. But I do believe that perhaps for now it is okay for signaling, but in the long run, I don't know how Chinese role is going to be seen and shaped. And China, if but if even if you look at it, China has an easier time brokering peace when it's not directly involved in a conflict, in a dispute. It's not really a direct stakeholder, but when it comes to its own interests, its own conflict, I do not really see the same approach that have been employed by China. And in fact, we have a very good example of India, of the South China Sea and the East China Sea as well. So I think this is where the things get tricky. Still, if this China, Russia, Iran engagement evolves into something that becomes concrete, into a structured alliance, into an actually a trilateral, Beijing may very well be able to cement itself as a norm setter, agenda shaper, as well as rule maker in the global diplomacy. And I think this is something where perhaps the US has to rethink of its role in the Middle East, because if the US keeps doing what it is doing and it doesn't come back to shape its own role, its own policy in the Middle East, it's definitely going to lose to China in a number of regions. But Middle East is absolutely on the top of China's list. So to conclude, I would say that the Middle East chessboard is absolutely shifting, and at this time, the US is not at the front, but it is China that is making the moves, and perhaps in the long run, it could win as well. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.